There's something almost immediately enchanting about the opening moments of Raya and the Last Dragon. Even before the story truly begins, the trailer sets a very specific tone, one of mysticism, danger, and wonder. Right off the bat, you notice how Disney leaned into visual storytelling to create a world that feels ancient yet fresh. The trailer doesn't rely on exposition. Instead, it drops you into the middle of a land called Kumandra, a place fractured into 5 distinct regions, each with its own culture, color palette, and architectural style. From the lush greenery of the heartlands to the rocky, jagged cliffs of Spine, you can tell that the visual designers poured an incredible amount of research and care into crafting an authentic, immersive fantasy world, inspired by Southeast Asian landscapes and aesthetics. It's not just fantasy fluff. They actually consulted with cultural experts to make the designs feel grounded. The trailer starts quietly, with an almost meditative calm, and that immediately sets it apart from typical action-adventure announcements. You hear the soft hum of the soundtrack, delicate, almost ethereal strings, and a light percussion underneath. And then, subtly, there's a voiceover from Raya herself, which isn't overly dramatic or over the top, just quiet, reflective, and sincere. She speaks of trust, of a fractured world, and of the quest that will inevitably define her. This is an unusual move for Disney trailers. They often lean heavily on jokes, big set pieces, or bombastic reveals. But here, the restraint works because it draws the audience into the stakes emotionally before anything else. You feel curiosity first, wonder second, and only later are you hit with excitement. Visually, the trailer balances that serenity with tension brilliantly. There are flashes of action sequences, Raya sprinting across rope bridges, narrowly avoiding collapsing terrain, and then more intimate moments with Sisu, the Last Dragon, who immediately shows personality and warmth even in just a few seconds of screen time. The animators did a phenomenal job of giving her a fluid, almost otherworldly presence without making her look cartoonishly exaggerated. Her movements are precise, organic, and imbued with a sense of weightlessness that reflects her magical nature. Watching the trailer, you sense that this film is going to marry humor with heartfelt drama, which is a tricky balance to pull off in animated features. But the trailer gives the impression that it will land well. One of the most striking things in the trailer is how the narrative stakes are conveyed without heavy exposition. There's the imagery of shards of the Dragon Gem, the mystical artifact that kept the world safe but has now been broken. You can feel the weight of loss in the visuals alone. Villages abandoned, landscapes scarred, and faces etched with suspicion and fear. Disney's marketing team was clever here. They hint at the central theme of trust and unity without explicitly spelling it out, letting the audience intuitively grasp the core conflict. The trailer almost feels like a poem, with visual motifs repeating to reinforce that central message, that the world is broken, and healing it requires more than just courage. It requires connection. There's also a clever pacing to the trailer. It opens slowly, introducing characters and world building through imagery rather than dialogue, then escalates to snippets of action without feeling frantic. You get just enough to see the scope: giant rivers, sweeping deserts, treacherous mountain passes. The danger feels real, and yet it's never overwhelming because the trailer intersperses moments of levity, like Sisu's playful smirk or her goofy interactions with Tuk Tuk, Raya's trusty animal companion. Those moments of humor are vital. They suggest that the film will balance intensity with warmth, and that audiences of all ages can engage without feeling bombarded by action. Sound design also stands out in this trailer. There's a layering of natural sounds: the rush of water, the creaking of wood, the whisper of wind across cliffs, underneath the music, which gives a tactile sense of presence. You almost feel like you're in the environment rather than just watching it. It's subtle, but it's incredibly effective in making the trailer resonate on a sensory level, beyond just visuals and dialogue. And when Sisu finally appears fully in the trailer, you hear a slight ethereal roar that's not meant to scare but to awe, signaling that she's not just another sidekick character. She's central to the mythos of the world. Another interesting aspect is the color story in the trailer. Each region of Kumandra has its own palette. Heart is rich and verdant, Fang is sharp and metallic, Spine is rugged with muted earth tones, Talon has coastal blues and greens, and Tail is dusty with orange browns. This not only gives visual variety, but subtly cues the audience into the unique cultures and challenges Raya will face. The filmmakers clearly wanted viewers to subconsciously recognize that the world is larger than just the immediate story, that there's history and depth behind each region, and that navigating it isn't just about geography. It's about diplomacy, understanding, and empathy. The trailer also teases the moral complexity of the story. It isn't a simple good versus evil tale. We see moments that suggest distrust among the various tribes, a past betrayal hinted at by the reactions of certain characters, and tension that isn't resolved by mere heroics. The stakes feel both personal and epic. Disney smartly chose to highlight that the film isn't just an adventure, but also an exploration of relationships, how broken trust affects communities, and how rebuilding it is an arduous but necessary process. That duality between external adventure and internal emotional growth is what gives the trailer its lingering impact. Then there's the voice cast glimpsed in the trailer. Kelly Marie Tran's Raya is expressive, balancing determination with vulnerability, and Awkwafina's Sisu already comes across as playful, witty, and endearing. The interplay between these two characters is immediately compelling because it's clear that the filmmakers aren't relying on generic comedic beats. There's personality, timing, and nuance baked into their performances. Even in just a minute or two of footage, you can sense that these characters will grow together in ways that are both humorous and emotionally resonant. Finally, the trailer leaves you with a sense of scale. There's a shot of the vast, shattered dragon gem, a reminder that the journey ahead is monumental. It's not just about recovering a magical artifact, it's about healing divisions, confronting fear, and restoring faith in a fractured world. The trailer closes on a note of hope without feeling forced, giving viewers a reason to invest emotionally in Raya's journey. By the time the trailer ends, you're not just curious, you're invested in the world, the stakes, and the characters, and that's a mark of a well-crafted marketing approach. What strikes me most watching this trailer is how deliberate every choice feels. From pacing to sound design, from visual motifs to character introduction. You can see the layers. A team that respects its audience's intelligence, that wants to intrigue rather than overwhelm. Disney isn't just selling a film. They're offering an experience, a promise that the story will take you somewhere meaningful, somewhere magical, and that it will challenge you to think about trust, loyalty, and the connections that bind us together. It's also worth noting that the trailer subtly communicates inclusivity and representation without making it feel preachy. Kumandra's cultures are inspired by multiple Southeast Asian nations, blending motifs, architecture, and folklore into a cohesive yet diverse fantasy setting. The visual authenticity is backed by research and consultation, which shows a level of care that's increasingly rare in big studio animation. This adds an educational layer, allowing audiences, particularly younger viewers, to absorb cultural richness while being entertained. And then there's the visual spectacle. The animation itself is almost tactile. You notice the way fabrics move, how hair reacts to wind, how water flows and reflects light. The trailer teases a film that isn't just animated, but meticulously crafted at a level where every frame could be paused and studied. This gives the sense that the movie won't just be a story you watch. It's a story you inhabit, an environment that draws you in through its artistry. Even the humor is carefully calibrated. Sisu's comedic timing isn't slapstick. It's witty, charming, and sometimes absurd, but always in service of character development and world building. The trailer hints at her role as more than comic relief. She's a guide, a confidant, and a catalyst for Raya's personal growth. You can tell that the dynamic between them will carry much of the film's emotional weight, and the trailer sets up expectations without overpromising. In essence, the trailer for Raya and the Last Dragon is a masterclass in restraint, design, and emotional resonance. It teases just enough action, character, and lore to capture interest, yet it leaves enough mystery to ensure audiences will want the full experience. It signals that this isn't just a typical animated adventure. It's a thoughtful, visually stunning, emotionally complex journey. And perhaps most importantly, it communicates that the story is rooted in themes that feel timely and universal. Trust, unity, and the courage to heal a fractured world. By the time you step away from the trailer, there's a lingering sense of anticipation. Not the hyperbolic kind often manufactured by marketing hype, but a genuine curiosity about how this story will unfold, how the characters will evolve, and whether the film will live up to the rich world the trailer has so carefully introduced. It's rare to see a teaser that feels this considered, and it sets the bar high for what audiences can expect when they finally sit down to watch the full feature. The story opens in Kumandra, a land once unified by dragons, who protected the humans and the magical dragon gem that kept peace and prosperity alive. Long before the events of the film, the dragons sacrificed themselves to save humanity from a destructive force known as the Tran, a dark, mindless entity that turns people to stone. That prologue is brief but visually striking. The animation immediately communicates both tragedy and grandeur. The dragon's noble sacrifice is depicted with sweeping shots that blend awe and melancholy, and it sets the emotional foundation for everything that follows. It's a tone that feels heavier than most Disney openings, suggesting the narrative will engage with themes of loss and responsibility rather than simply embarking on a straightforward adventure. Raya, the film's central character, is introduced as the guardian of the Heart Tribe, the region where the dragon gem originated. She's shown as disciplined, fiercely intelligent, and skilled in combat, yet with an undercurrent of empathy that defines her character from the outset. One of the brilliant elements of this introduction is how her personality is revealed through action rather than exposition. We see her balancing poise with agility, practicing martial movements, and interacting with her father, Chief Benja, in ways that establish her as both a protector and a daughter who deeply respects the values of her people. The dynamics of this father-daughter relationship are integral, as they set up both the emotional stakes and the moral compass that guides Raya throughout the story. The world building in these early moments is remarkable. Each region of Kumandra, the heart, fang, spine, talon, and tail lands, has its own identity, not just in terms of geography, but in culture, language, and social dynamics. The filmmakers clearly devoted extensive research to crafting environments that feel lived in. You get a sense of history embedded in the architecture, marketplaces, and costumes. There's a naturalism in the way people move and interact in their respective regions. It feels like a functioning civilization, rather than just a fantasy backdrop. These details subtly reinforce the film's central theme of unity and division. By visually distinguishing the tribes, the movie sets up a narrative where cooperation is necessary yet complicated, creating organic tension before the story's main conflict even begins. The inciting incident arrives when the dragon gem is stolen, shattering into pieces and unleashing the Tran upon Kumandra. This event is a turning point not just for the plot, but for Raya's character development. The chaos that follows, the destruction of villages, the petrification of innocent people, the immediate need for leadership, forces Raya into a journey that is both external and internal. The film does something clever here. It doesn't merely make her quest about reclaiming a magical artifact. It frames the quest as a test of her ability to understand and bridge divisions among the fractured tribes. The Tran are a looming existential threat, yes, but the deeper challenge is human distrust and historical grievances. This duality gives the story a sense of depth and moral weight unusual for animated features targeted at a family audience. Raya's first step in her journey is to seek the last dragon, Sisu, who is believed to hold the power to restore the gem and ultimately save the world. Their meeting is both humorous and revealing. Sisu's personality is deliberately distinct from traditional dragon archetypes. She's quirky, self-deprecating, and overtly playful. which contrasts sharply with Raya's disciplined, serious demeanor. Their initial interactions are marked by miscommunication, mismatched expectations, and subtle humor. Yet there's an undercurrent of mutual recognition. Both understand the stakes and, perhaps intuitively, that they need one another. This sets up the central dynamic of the film, a partnership that is as much about trust and mutual growth as it is about accomplishing a mission. The journey to reunite the Dragon Gem pieces forces Raya and Sisu to traverse the fractured lands of Kumandra. Each region presents distinct challenges that are both literal and metaphorical. Fang, for example, is governed by an authoritarian ruler, Chief Varana, who embodies suspicion and control. The Spine Lands are treacherous physically, with jagged cliffs and dangerous pathways, but they also metaphorically represent the rigidity and inflexibility that prevent people from trusting one another. The filmmakers cleverly use these environmental and political contrasts to reflect the larger themes of division and mistrust. Every obstacle Raya encounters isn't just a plot device. It's a narrative mirror reflecting the fractured state of the world she's trying to heal. Throughout these adventures, the film balances tension with humor and moments of vulnerability. Tuk Tuk, Raya's rolling, pill-shaped animal companion, provides comic relief without ever undermining the story's gravity. His presence also reinforces Raya's humanity. She's a capable warrior, but she's also caring and protective, not just of the quest, but of the friends she gathers along the way. These small, quiet interactions, petting Tuk Tuk, sharing a laugh with Sisu, or reacting to the absurdity of a situation, ground the narrative emotionally. The film frequently juxtaposes moments of peril with these humanizing beats, ensuring that audiences remain emotionally invested in the characters rather than just the spectacle. The introduction of antagonistic forces adds another layer of complexity. Namari, the Princess of Fang, is initially presented as a foil to Raya. Her motivations are ambiguous in early scenes, which is a smart storytelling choice. Rather than presenting her as a one-dimensional villain, the film builds tension by showing that Namari's actions are informed by fear, legacy, and the responsibility of leadership. This nuanced portrayal elevates the narrative stakes. When she eventually opposes Raya, it's not just a physical confrontation, it's a clash of philosophies, of approaches to leadership and trust. The trailer hints at this tension, but the film fully develops it, creating moments of genuine emotional conflict that resonate beyond the immediate action. A notable sequence in the story involves a journey across a river that separates the heart and tail lands. This isn't just a set piece, it's an allegorical moment. The river represents barriers, both literal and symbolic, that prevent unity. The scene is visually stunning, with flowing water reflecting light in ways that highlight the artistry of the animation. The sequence also serves as a character test. Raya must confront her instinct for control, her distrust of others, and her tendency to shoulder responsibility alone. Sisu and other allies challenge her assumptions, gently nudging her toward collaboration. In these moments, the narrative cleverly teaches lessons about leadership and empathy without ever resorting to didactic storytelling. The film also excels in pacing. It doesn't rush from one challenge to the next, but allows moments of introspection. For instance, quiet night scenes where Raya gazes at the stars, or Sisu reflects on her past, remind viewers that the stakes are deeply personal. These pauses are essential. They prevent the story from becoming purely action-driven, and allow the audience to connect with the emotional and philosophical undercurrents of the film. The trailer captures some of this with reflective shots, but in the actual movie, these sequences are expanded, showing that the filmmakers value depth alongside spectacle. By the midpoint, Raya has begun to piece together the Dragon Gem, but also faces moral dilemmas that test her integrity. She encounters factions who claim the gem for themselves, villagers traumatized by the Droon, and situations where the right choice isn't immediately clear. These challenges push her character growth organically, ensuring that her journey isn't simply about triumph over external threats, but about understanding the complexities of human behavior. The narrative consistently frames decisions in shades of gray, which is a refreshing departure from the binary morality often seen in animated adventure films. Sisu's role continues to evolve. What begins as comic relief gradually transforms into mentorship and emotional support. She's both a magical force and a narrative conscience, prompting Raya to consider perspectives beyond her own. Their dynamic underscores the film's central thesis. Trust isn't given, it's earned, and it requires patience, vulnerability, and sometimes humility. The writers handle this with subtlety, embedding lessons in dialogue and action without ever veering into preachiness. The tension escalates as the Drune spreads further across Kumandra, petrifying entire communities. These sequences are dark, without being excessively frightening for younger viewers. The animators use light, color, and environmental cues to maintain suspense and convey danger, while keeping the focus on Raya's response and problem-solving. Her leadership qualities are tested repeatedly, and the audience witnesses how her strategic thinking, empathy, and resilience combine to address crises that are both immediate and symbolic. By the end of this first part of the journey, Raya has not only gathered allies, but has begun to confront the limitations of her worldview. The narrative subtly emphasizes that solving Kumandra's problems requires more than just recovering magical artifacts. It demands reconciliation, communication, and the courage to forgive. This thematic layering gives the story a resonance that goes beyond its fantastical setting, appealing to viewers of all ages. As the journey progresses, Raya and her companions move into the Fanglands, which immediately feel different from the previous regions. Fang is depicted as a land of sharp contrasts, towering cliffs, densely populated cities, and a militaristic social structure that conveys both discipline and suspicion. It's clear that this region is shaped by fear, and the filmmakers use architecture and color grading to visually reinforce that sense of control and distrust. The cityscapes are dense, with a mix of narrow alleyways, crowded marketplaces, and looming fortifications, suggesting a population accustomed to hierarchy and vigilance. This setting allows the narrative to explore how past traumas influence leadership decisions and societal behavior, reinforcing the film's underlying messages about trust and unity. Raya's first encounters with Namaari and Fang are fraught with tension and subtle power dynamics. The two characters are set up as mirrors of each other, both skilled warriors, both heirs to leadership, but each shaped by different experiences and values. Their initial rivalry isn't purely antagonistic. There's a sense of mutual respect that underscores the story's complexity. The dialogue here is layered, often conveying more through subtext and body language than through overt exposition. You can tell that these interactions are designed to establish a long-term character arc, where personal conflict intertwines with the larger mission of reassembling the Dragon Gem. A standout sequence in Fang involves a chase through the city streets, which blends high-energy action with strategic thinking. Raya's agility and combat skills are on full display, but the sequence also emphasizes her intelligence and problem-solving abilities. She navigates not just physical obstacles, but social ones, engaging with the Fang citizens in ways that highlight her diplomacy and empathy. Sisu provides comic relief here as well, using humor to diffuse tension. Yet her moments of insight often guide Raya toward creative solutions. The choreography of this scene is meticulously crafted, with camera angles and timing that maintain clarity despite the fast pace, showcasing the animator's skill in balancing spectacle with storytelling. As the team progresses, they encounter villages affected by the Drune, which introduces a deeper emotional dimension to the narrative. The filmmakers take care to humanize the consequences of the Drune's rampage, showing the fear, grief, and resilience of ordinary people. One poignant scene depicts villagers turning to stone mid-task, leaving empty spaces in their homes and markets. These visual choices are powerful. They communicate loss and disruption without needing dialogue, allowing viewers to emotionally engage with the stakes. Raya's responses in these moments reveal her compassion and leadership style, which balances decisiveness with empathy. The Spinelands, with their jagged cliffs and treacherous terrain, present a different kind of challenge. Here, the journey tests physical endurance and strategic thinking. Crossing rickety bridges, navigating narrow pathways, and avoiding natural hazards create tension, while also symbolizing the metaphorical dangers of inflexibility and isolation. The Spineland sequences are particularly notable for their cinematography and animation. Lighting and camera perspectives are used to heighten suspense, often placing Raya and Sisu against stark backdrops that emphasize the scale and danger of their environment. These scenes reinforce the story's recurring theme, that navigating divided regions requires adaptability, courage, and trust in companions. During their time in Spine, the bond between Raya and Sisu deepens. Early comic interactions evolve into meaningful collaboration. Sisu's insights, often delivered with humor, help Raya reconsider rigid assumptions about leadership, morality, and trust. These moments are critical because they highlight the film's emphasis on interpersonal growth. The relationship is portrayed as mutually transformative. Sisu's optimism and unconventional thinking challenge Raya's cautious pragmatism, while Raya's determination and focus give purpose to Sisu's whimsical energy. The filmmakers use this dynamic to convey a broader message, that effective leadership and problem-solving often require openness to perspectives different from one's own. As the plot unfolds, Namaari's role grows more complicated. While initially positioned as an adversary, her actions reveal motivations rooted in responsibility to her people and fear of repeating past mistakes. The film explores the tension between personal loyalty and communal obligation, giving Namaari depth beyond a traditional villain archetype. Her interactions with Raya are layered with nuance. Moments of confrontation, subtle empathy, and moral ambiguity contribute to the narrative complexity. These elements elevate the story, showing that conflict in this world is rarely black and white, and that understanding others' perspectives is essential to achieving lasting resolution. In Talonlands, the narrative introduces new environmental and social challenges. Coastal landscapes, monsoon-like weather, and riverine settlements require the team to adapt to changing conditions. The filmmakers use these sequences to highlight Raya's resourcefulness and strategic acumen. Navigating these conditions is not just about survival. It's a metaphor for the flexibility required to build trust among fractured communities. Visual storytelling remains a priority. Waves crashing against cliffs, mud-slicked paths, and sudden downpours create sensory immersion that enhances both tension and narrative depth. The taillands, dusty and sun-bleached, present a contrasting tone. Here, the focus shifts to diplomacy and negotiation, emphasizing the importance of cultural sensitivity and understanding. Raya must engage with leaders and villagers whose histories and values differ from her own, further reinforcing the film's core exploration of trust and unity. These sequences are slower paced, allowing for dialogue-driven character development and reflection. The filmmakers balance narrative depth with visual richness, ensuring that even less action-heavy scenes maintain engagement through detailed animation and expressive performances. Throughout these journeys, the Droon remains an ever-present threat, spreading with relentless inevitability. The filmmakers cleverly escalate tension by alternating between high-action sequences and quieter, emotionally charged moments. The Droon's design, an amorphous, shadowy force, evokes both fear and awe without overwhelming younger viewers. Its presence reinforces the stakes, while also allowing the narrative to explore the psychological and social effects of widespread danger. Villages, families, and tribal leaders all react differently, illustrating a spectrum of human responses to crisis. Raya's leadership is tested not just in combat, but in mediation, empathy, and moral judgment. As the journey approaches its climax, Raya and Sisu's partnership has evolved into a genuine camaraderie, balancing wisdom, courage, and humor. By this point, Raya has started to understand that the fractured nature of Kumandra is not just a result of the Droon, but of decades, even generations, of distrust among the tribes. The film emphasizes that the path to restoration isn't simply about reassembling the Dragon Gem, it's about healing relationships, learning empathy, and confronting one's own prejudices. The narrative ensures that the audience recognizes Raya's personal growth as intertwined with the external quest, which elevates the story from a standard fantasy adventure to a reflective exploration of leadership and trust. The final confrontation begins in the Fanglands, where Namaari has consolidated her power and is determined to secure the Dragon Gem for her own region. The animators heighten tension with sweeping visuals. Towering cliffs, storm-lashed cities, and surging rivers all mirror the internal conflict between Raya and Namaari. Their duel is more than physical combat. It is a collision of philosophies. Raya embodies collaboration and faith in others, while Namaari represents caution, self-interest, and the scars left by betrayal. The choreography of this sequence is meticulously designed, blending martial arts influences with fantasy movement, yet always keeping character motivation at the forefront. Each strike, dodge, and leap carries emotional weight, not just spectacle. Sisu's role in this climactic sequence underscores her transformation from comic relief to mentor and essential ally. She demonstrates the unique magic of the dragons, blending agility, elemental power, and cunning. Yet her most important contribution is guidance. Sisu's belief in Raya and in the possibility of unity reinforces the film's thematic heart. Their teamwork reflects a subtle but powerful message that individual strength is insufficient without mutual trust and cooperation. This idea resonates across the film, reinforcing the moral stakes alongside the physical ones. A pivotal moment occurs when the last pieces of the Dragon Gem are recovered. Here, the film shifts from action to emotional resonance. Raya must confront the consequences of past choices and recognize the courage required to forgive and rebuild. The animation emphasizes intimacy and focus. The camera lingers on expressions, subtle gestures, and eye contact, rather than relying solely on broad spectacle. It's a testament to the filmmaker's understanding that the story's emotional payoff depends on character connection as much as on magical resolution. The Droon, previously an unstoppable shadow, is addressed through both strategy and trust. Instead of a simplistic battle of strength, the narrative frames the resolution as a cooperative act. Each tribe's willingness to put aside historical grievances and work together reflects the thematic climax: unity as a form of power. The visual storytelling here is particularly striking. Shards of the Dragon Gem converge, light spreads across the land, and the petrified citizens are restored. The imagery is both literal and symbolic. The restoration of Kumandra mirrors the restoration of trust, illustrating the film's central message in a tangible way. Raya and Namaari's final interaction is subtle, yet emotionally charged. There's recognition of shared hardship, mutual respect, and the understanding that leadership carries burdens unique to each individual. Namaari's choice to release her claim on the gem underscores the moral complexity of the story. It's not a simple victory, but a negotiated peace. This resolution reinforces that leadership requires empathy and sacrifice, aligning with the narrative's recurring motifs of trust and reconciliation. Sisu's departure is both poignant and celebratory. She's fulfilled her purpose, and while her absence might feel bittersweet, it emphasizes the importance of human agency. The dragons were protectors, yes, but the humans must now maintain harmony themselves. This closure reinforces the story's emphasis on responsibility, courage, and the idea that true power lies in cooperation and moral integrity. The emotional beats here are layered. Gratitude, triumph, and reflection coexist, giving the ending depth that resonates beyond the immediate spectacle. Post-climactic sequences focus on rebuilding and reconciliation. Villages that were once divided are depicted engaging in shared festivals, markets, and celebrations, signaling the gradual restoration of societal cohesion. Raya is portrayed not as a triumphant conqueror, but as a humble leader who has earned the trust of her people. These closing scenes underline that the journey was as much about emotional and social restoration as it was about defeating the Droon, making the narrative's conclusion satisfying on multiple levels. Even in quieter, seemingly transitional moments, the film maintains thematic consistency. Conversations between Raya and secondary characters emphasize lessons learned, reflections on past mistakes, and visions for the future. These interactions provide narrative closure while reinforcing the story's moral framework. Trust, collaboration, and empathy are essential to enduring peace. The filmmaker's restraint here ensures that the conclusion feels earned rather than abrupt or sentimentalized. The animation throughout these sequences continues to impress. Water flows realistically, fabrics move with weight and texture, and facial expressions convey subtle emotional nuances. The filmmakers use lighting and color to reinforce mood and thematic undertones. Warm hues signal restoration and unity, while muted or shadowed tones depict conflict or mistrust. These artistic choices enhance narrative comprehension, subtly guiding the audience through both physical and emotional landscapes. Sisu's humor, introduced in earlier acts, is woven into the resolution without undermining stakes. Her playful personality provides moments of levity amidst high tension, and these moments are strategically placed to sustain audience engagement and humanize the fantastical elements. Humor, in this context, serves to deepen character relationships rather than simply entertain, highlighting the film's commitment to integrated storytelling. Raya's ultimate decision to trust Namari and the other tribes reflects her evolved perspective. The narrative has carefully constructed this arc over the course of the journey, beginning with skepticism and isolation, developing through collaborative problem-solving and moral dilemmas, and culminating in a nuanced understanding of leadership. This progression is central to the film's resonance, ensuring that the story concludes on an emotionally satisfying note that aligns with its thematic ambitions. The epilogue, showing Kumandra restored and its people engaged in collaborative rebuilding, reinforces the narrative's message without excessive exposition. By visual means alone, scenes of shared labor, communal celebrations, and restored landscapes, the film communicates triumph, unity, and hope. These sequences feel earned because the narrative has consistently balanced character-driven moments with plot-driven stakes, ensuring that the audience has been emotionally invested throughout. Even subtle details in the animation support the story's thematic depth. Small gestures, background interactions, and environmental continuity reinforce the sense of a living, breathing world. By attending to these micro-level details, the filmmakers ensure that viewers remain immersed in Kumandra's recovery, further enhancing the story's impact. The final scene with Raya reflects the culmination of her journey. A leader who has learned that power is not about control or dominance, but about empathy, trust, and shared responsibility. Her reflective expression, combined with a quiet moment of triumph alongside her allies, encapsulates the narrative's emotional and philosophical core. The filmmakers achieve a balance between spectacle and intimacy, ensuring that the story's conclusion resonates on both visual and emotional levels. In essence, the full arc of Raya and the Last Dragon is a layered blend of adventure, personal growth, moral complexity, and visual storytelling. Every obstacle, character interaction, and environmental challenge is designed to reinforce the themes of trust, unity, and empathy. The story doesn't rely solely on fantastical elements to engage the audience. It engages through emotional resonance, nuanced character development, and a carefully constructed moral framework. The result is a film that works on multiple levels: as a thrilling adventure, as a character study, and as a meditation on leadership and human connection. When Raya and the Last Dragon was approaching its release window, the entertainment industry was still in a very unusual moment. Studios everywhere were trying to figure out how movies could reach audiences when theaters around the world were either closed, operating at limited capacity, or constantly shifting policies week by week. The ripple effect of the global disruption caused by COVID-19 had changed the entire release strategy for Hollywood, and Disney in particular found itself experimenting with hybrid distribution models that had never really been attempted on such a large scale before. So the context around this film's release is almost as interesting as the movie itself. By early 2021, Disney had already started testing a new system through its streaming platform, Disney+, where certain high-profile titles could be released simultaneously in theaters and through a premium streaming purchase. This wasn't the traditional straight-to-streaming model, and it wasn't the normal theatrical rollout either. Instead, it was a hybrid structure called Premier Access, which essentially allowed subscribers to pay an additional fee to watch a brand new film at home the same day it hit theaters. For Raya and the Last Dragon, that approach became one of the most talked about aspects of its launch. Officially, the film premiered on March 5th, 2021. In normal times, an animated Disney adventure like this would have been treated as a massive theatrical event. Wide global rollout, massive marketing push, merchandise tie-ins, and a long box office run. But the industry landscape was still stabilizing, and Disney had to make a decision that balanced safety, audience accessibility, and financial practicality. So the studio opted for the simultaneous strategy: theatrical release where cinemas were open, and premiere access on Disney Plus for viewers who preferred or needed to watch from home. That choice was controversial in some circles. Theater chains worried about long-term implications, while streaming audiences appreciated the convenience. From a business perspective, though, it was a fascinating experiment in how blockbuster filmmaking might evolve in the streaming era. Now, stepping back and looking at Disney's animation pipeline during that period helps explain why the studio remained confident in this project despite the uncertainty. Disney Animation had been riding an impressive creative wave throughout the 2010s. Films like Frozen, Moana, and Zootopia had all proven that original animated storytelling could still dominate the global box office, while also resonating culturally. Those movies weren't just successful financially, they reshaped expectations around what modern Disney animation could be. Instead of relying entirely on fairy tale adaptations, the studio began exploring more original worlds inspired by diverse cultures and mythologies. Raya and the Last Dragon fit directly into that evolving philosophy. The idea behind the film had been in development for several years before release. Disney's creative team wanted to build a fantasy setting inspired by Southeast Asian cultures, mythology, architecture, food, martial traditions, and folklore. Rather than representing a single country, the filmmakers created Kumandra as a fictional world influenced by multiple nations across the region. To make that vision feel authentic, Disney assembled what they called the Southeast Asia Story Trust, a group of cultural consultants who advised the creative team throughout production. That level of consultation became increasingly important in Hollywood animation during the late 2010s and early 2020s. Studios had learned from previous criticism that audiences appreciated cultural representation, but they also expected it to be handled thoughtfully and respectfully. So, with Raya and the Last Dragon, Disney aimed to combine fantasy storytelling with grounded cultural inspiration, making the world feel believable, even though dragons and magical gems were part of the narrative. Behind the scenes, the production itself faced unusual challenges because much of the film was completed during the pandemic. Animation studios rely heavily on collaboration. Artists, animators, lighting teams, and directors constantly reviewing sequences together. But during 2020, many Disney animators were working remotely from home studios, instead of inside the massive animation building in Burbank. That shift forced the production pipeline to adapt in ways the industry had never tried at this scale before. Instead of everyone reviewing animation shots in the same room, teams were communicating through video calls, remote rendering systems, and digital collaboration tools. It sounds mundane now, but at the time it was a major technical shift for large-scale animation. Despite those obstacles, the final product still achieved the level of visual polish audiences expected from Disney Animation. That alone became a quiet success story inside the industry. Proof that a massive animated feature could still be completed even under extremely unusual working conditions. Another interesting aspect of the film's release context is how Disney positioned it in relation to its animation brands. The company has two major animation studios, Walt Disney Animation Studios and Pixar Animation Studios. Both produce animated films, but historically they've had slightly different storytelling identities. Pixar often leans toward emotionally introspective storytelling with technological innovation, while Disney Animation traditionally focuses more on mythic storytelling, musical structure, and fantasy adventure. Raya and the Last Dragon firmly sits in that Disney animation tradition, an epic quest story set in a richly imagined world. But interestingly, it also incorporates more action choreography than many earlier Disney animated films. The filmmakers drew inspiration from martial arts cinema and Southeast Asian fighting styles, which gives the action sequences a different rhythm compared to the musical spectacle audiences might expect from something like Frozen. Marketing for the film leaned heavily into that adventurous tone. Trailers emphasized the expansive world of Kumandra, the fractured tribes, the search for the last dragon, and the underlying theme of rebuilding trust in a divided world. Disney's promotional material highlighted the sweeping environments, jungles, rivers, desert plains, cliffside cities, and presented Raya as a determined warrior navigating a dangerous landscape. But what's fascinating when you look back at that marketing campaign is how it balanced scale with emotion. The trailers didn't just promise action, they constantly returned to the idea that this story was about rebuilding trust between people who had stopped believing in each other. That thematic focus actually made the film feel very relevant to the cultural moment in which it was released. Remember, audiences in early 2021 had just spent an entire year dealing with global uncertainty, isolation, and social tension. A story centered around reconnecting communities and restoring faith in others carried a resonance that probably felt even stronger during that period. Financially, the box office results ended up reflecting the unusual circumstances of the time. With many theaters operating at reduced capacity, the film's theatrical earnings didn't reach the heights typical of Disney animated blockbusters. But when you factor in premiere access purchases and eventual streaming viewership, the movie still reached a massive global audience. In other words, its success can't really be measured by traditional box office metrics alone. It was one of the early examples of how Hollywood studios began redefining what success looked like in the streaming era. And looking back now, several years later, Raya and the Last Dragon occupies a really interesting place in Disney's animation history. It represents a transitional moment, not just creatively, but industrially. It arrived at the exact point when theatrical distribution, streaming platforms, and global audiences were all reshaping the way big movies reached viewers. In many ways, the film became part of a larger story about how Hollywood adapted during one of the most disruptive periods in modern entertainment history. And that context adds another layer of appreciation when revisiting the movie today, because it wasn't just a fantasy adventure about restoring a broken world. It was also released during a moment when the real world was trying to do the same thing. One of the things that really gives Raya and the Last Dragon its personality is the voice cast. Animated movies live or die on whether the voices feel authentic to the characters, because unlike live-action films, the actors aren't carrying scenes with facial expressions or physical movement. Everything has to come through tone, rhythm, emotion, and timing. And what's interesting about this particular lineup is that Disney chose performers who bring very distinct personalities, rather than the traditional big musical theater voice approach that older animated films often relied on. At the center of the story is Raya herself, voiced by Kelly Marie Tran. When you first hear her performance, there's something immediately grounded about it. Tran doesn't play Raya as an exaggerated hero or a stereotypical animated protagonist. Instead, she gives the character a very natural cadence, sometimes determined, sometimes guarded, sometimes quietly reflective. That balance matters because Raya is a warrior, yes, but she's also someone carrying the emotional weight of a broken world. Tran's delivery often feels restrained in the best possible way, letting the character's vulnerability surface during quieter moments. And it's interesting to remember that the role actually changed hands during production. Early in development, Raya was voiced by Cassie Steele, but the filmmakers ultimately decided they wanted to adjust the character's direction. That's when Kelly Marie Tran stepped in and essentially re-recorded the performance with a slightly older, more mature emotional tone. The change gave Raya a sense of experience and quiet resilience that fits the story's themes of responsibility and leadership. Opposite Raya is the Last Dragon herself, Sisu, voiced by Awkwafina. Now, this casting choice is fascinating because Sisu could have easily been played as a mystical, regal creature, something majestic and distant. But the filmmakers went in the opposite direction. Awkwafina brings an offbeat, comedic energy to the role that makes Sisu feel approachable and warm, rather than intimidating. Her performance leans heavily into personality. Sisu is optimistic, a little awkward, and surprisingly chatty for a legendary dragon. Awkwafina's comedic instincts help turn what could have been a typical magical mentor figure into something much more human. She delivers lines with this casual, conversational rhythm that contrasts nicely with Raya's more disciplined personality. That difference creates a dynamic where the characters constantly challenge each other's worldview. Raya with skepticism and caution, Sisu with faith and hope. Then there's one of the most important supporting characters in the entire film, Namaari, the Princess of Fang, voiced by Gemma Chan. Namaari is easily one of the most interesting figures in the story because she occupies that gray area between rival and ally. Chan plays her with a calm, controlled intensity. Her voice has this quiet authority that fits someone raised to lead a powerful tribe. What makes Namaari compelling is that Chan doesn't lean into villain energy. Instead, her delivery carries a sense of conflict, like someone constantly balancing duty with personal belief. You hear determination, but also hesitation. That layered performance helps prevent the character from becoming a simple antagonist. Instead, Namaari feels like someone shaped by the same fractured world that shaped Raya. Raya's father, Chief Benja, is voiced by Daniel Dae Kim, and his presence is crucial even though he isn't physically present throughout most of the story. Benja represents the ideal of unity that Raya struggles to uphold after the world falls apart. Kim's voice has a calm, reassuring quality that makes the character feel wise and compassionate. There's a warmth to the way he speaks to Raya in the early scenes, especially when he explains his belief that the tribes of Kumandra can learn to trust each other again. Those conversations become emotional anchors for Raya later in the film, because they represent the values she's trying to protect, even when the world around her seems determined to prove those values wrong. Another memorable character introduced during Raya's journey is Boone, the young boat captain, voiced by Isaac Wang. Boone is a kid trying to survive in a world that has become dangerous and uncertain. What makes his character work is the mix of entrepreneurial confidence and childlike optimism. He runs a tiny shrimp boat restaurant and speaks like someone who's been forced to grow up faster than he should have. Wang's performance captures that balance nicely. His voice has the enthusiasm of a kid who still believes in adventure, but also the determination of someone who's learned to fend for himself. Boone brings a bit of youthful energy into the group dynamic, and his interactions with Raya and Sisu help lighten the tone during heavier parts of the journey. Another character audiences tend to remember is Little Noi, voiced by Thalia Tran. Noi is technically a toddler, but she operates like a tiny, street-smart hustler, running scams with the help of a trio of mischievous, monkey-like companions. The humor of the character comes from the contrast between her adorable appearance and her surprisingly strategic behavior. Thalia Tran doesn't deliver long stretches of dialogue here, but the vocal reactions, laughs, sounds, playful noises, help sell the character's mischievous personality. It's one of those performances where the energy matters more than the words. Then there's Tong, the imposing warrior from the Spine tribe, voiced by Benedict Wong. At first glance, Tong looks intimidating. He's large, heavily armored, and carries himself like someone who's used to surviving harsh conditions. But Wong plays him with a softness that slowly reveals the character's emotional depth. His voice carries a quiet sadness that hints at the losses he's experienced during the Drunes spread across Kumandra. As the story progresses, Tong becomes one of the emotional pillars of the group, representing resilience and the ability to move forward even after devastating tragedy. And of course, we can't forget Tuk Tuk, Raya's loyal rolling companion. Tuk Tuk doesn't speak in full dialogue the way other characters do, but his personality is expressed through sounds, reactions, and body language. The animators give him an almost puppy-like loyalty that makes him instantly lovable. He's part armadillo, part pillbug, and somehow also a motorcycle when Raya rides across the landscape. What makes the ensemble work is that each character represents a different corner of Kumandra. They come from different tribes, different backgrounds, and different experiences with the fractured world they live in. By the time they're traveling together, the group becomes a miniature version of what Kumandra could be if its people learned to cooperate again. And that's really the key to the casting choices. None of these performances feel overly theatrical or exaggerated. The actors approach the characters as people first, people with fears, regrets, humor, and hope. That approach helps ground the fantasy elements of the story. So even though the film includes dragons, magical artifacts, and shadowy monsters, the emotional core always comes back to the characters themselves. And thanks to a carefully chosen voice cast, those characters feel believable enough that audiences can connect with them, even in a world filled with myth and magic. When people hear about Raya and the Last Dragon for the first time, the easiest way to describe it, without giving away the full experience, is that it's essentially a journey across a broken world. But that description only scratches the surface, because the real appeal of the story isn't just the adventure. It's the emotional and cultural landscape the film builds around that journey. At its core, the movie takes place in the fictional land of Kumandra, a place that used to exist as one united kingdom. Long before the events of the film, humans and dragons lived together in harmony. The dragons weren't just mythical creatures flying around the sky. They were protectors, guardians of a magical force that kept balance in the world. But something catastrophic happened. A dark presence known as the Tran spread across the land, turning people into stone and threatening the survival of humanity itself. In a desperate act to save the world, the dragons sacrificed their power to create the Dragon Gem, a magical artifact that pushed the Tran back and restored life to the people who had been turned to stone. But even though the world was saved, the unity of Kumandra didn't survive. Instead of rebuilding together, the human tribes turned against each other, fighting over control of the gem and the power it represented. Over time, the single kingdom split into 5 separate lands: Heart, Fang, Spine, Talon, and Tail. Each region developed its own culture, leadership, and identity. The problem is that these divisions didn't just create geographical borders. They created distrust, suspicion, generations of people growing up believing that the other tribes couldn't be trusted. That's the fractured world Raya grows up in. Raya herself is the daughter of Chief Benja, the leader of the Heart tribe. Heart is the land responsible for protecting the Dragon Gem, which makes Raya's role incredibly important even before the main story begins. She's trained as a guardian, someone who must defend the gem and preserve what little unity remains in Kumandra. But the story truly begins when a fragile attempt at peace collapses. The leaders of the different tribes gather in Heart under the hope that maybe, just maybe, they can rebuild trust and reunite the land. Unfortunately, old suspicions run deep. A moment of betrayal leads to the Dragon Gem being shattered into multiple pieces. And when the gem breaks, the Tran return. The same destructive force that once nearly wiped out humanity begins spreading across Kumandra again. Entire villages turn to stone. Cities fall silent. What was once a fractured but functioning world quickly becomes a place defined by survival and fear. Years later, Raya sets out on a mission that feels almost impossible. She believes the only way to restore Kumandra is to find the last remaining dragon, a mythical being named Sisu, who might hold the power needed to bring the Dragon Gem back together. The search for Sisu becomes the beginning of a long journey across all 5 lands of Kumandra. Along the way, Raya encounters different communities struggling to survive in their own ways. Some regions have become harsh and defensive. Others have adapted through cleverness and trade. Every place she visits reflects how the division of the world has shaped the people living in it. Eventually, Raya does find Sisu. But the dragon she meets isn't exactly what she expected. Instead of a grand, intimidating creature from ancient legend, Sisu is playful, curious, and surprisingly human in her personality. She's powerful, yes, but she's also full of humor and optimism. That optimism becomes incredibly important because Raya herself has grown up in a world where trusting anyone outside her own tribe feels dangerous. So the journey transforms into something bigger than a quest for magical pieces of the Dragon Gem. As Raya and Sisu travel through Kumandra, they gather allies from different tribes, people who have also been shaped by loss, hardship, and the spread of the Drune. Each new companion adds a different perspective on survival and trust. Some characters are cautious, some are hopeful. Others have simply learned to live in the broken world as it is. But what gradually emerges is the realization that rebuilding the Dragon Gem alone won't fix Kumandra's problems. The deeper issue is the distrust that caused the world to fracture in the first place. Every encounter forces Raya to confront that reality. Should she trust someone who once betrayed her? Should she rely on people from rival tribes? Is unity actually possible in a world where everyone has been taught to protect their own interests first? These questions form the emotional backbone of the movie. The adventure itself is exciting. There are action sequences, clever escapes, and moments of magical spectacle. But the real story is about whether people can learn to believe in each other again. Even the relationship between Raya and Namaari reflects that theme. The two characters grew up on opposite sides of the conflict, shaped by different leaders and different expectations. Their rivalry carries both personal history and political tension, making their interactions unpredictable. At times, they seem capable of understanding each other. At other moments, they fall back into the mistrust that has defined their lives. That push and pull becomes one of the most compelling aspects of the film because it mirrors the larger conflict across Kumandra itself. And as the journey continues, the threat of the Drune becomes more urgent. Villages disappear. Entire regions fall silent. The world Raya is trying to save grows smaller and more fragile with each passing moment. Which means the stakes keep rising. Not just for the mission, but for the idea that unity is still possible. By the time the story reaches its final act, the question isn't just whether Raya can bring the Dragon Gem back together. The real question is whether the people of Kumandra are ready to trust each other again after generations of division. And that's what makes the story resonate beyond its fantasy setting. Because even though the film is filled with dragons, magic, and mythical landscapes, the central idea is surprisingly grounded. A broken world can only be restored if the people living in it decide that cooperation is stronger than fear. That message sits quietly underneath the adventure the entire time, shaping every decision Raya makes and every relationship she forms during the journey across Kumandra. When you sit down and really examine Raya and the Last Dragon, the first thing that becomes clear is that this is one of those Disney animated movies that's doing a lot more beneath the surface than it might appear at first glance. On the surface, sure, it's a fantasy adventure. There are dragons, magical artifacts, martial arts-style combat scenes, and a journey across a beautifully designed world. But once you start paying attention to the layers of storytelling, the film reveals itself as a surprisingly thoughtful meditation on trust, leadership, and the emotional scars left behind by division. One of the film's strongest qualities is its visual storytelling. The animation coming out of Walt Disney Animation Studios during the late 2010s and early 2020s had reached a level of refinement that's honestly remarkable to watch frame by frame. The environments in Kumandra feel enormous and lived in. Rivers shimmer with subtle reflections. Wind moves through grass and fabric naturally. And character animation captures tiny facial expressions that convey emotion without needing dialogue. There's a particular attention to texture throughout the film. Armor looks heavy. Stone surfaces feel weathered. Wooden structures creak and bend slightly when characters move across them. These details might sound minor, but they create a sense of physical reality inside a fantasy setting. When Raya runs across a narrow bridge or rides across a dusty plain on tuk-tuk, you can almost feel the weight and movement of the environment around her. Another element that stands out is the action choreography. Disney animated films historically leaned more toward musical spectacle or broad adventure set pieces, but Raya and the Last Dragon introduces something slightly different. The combat sequences draw inspiration from Southeast Asian martial arts traditions. The movements are quick, grounded, and strategic, rather than exaggerated or purely acrobatic. You see that especially in the confrontations between Raya and Namaari. These fights aren't chaotic explosions of motion. They're calculated exchanges where each character is reading the other's intentions. That gives the action a sense of tension and precision that feels closer to live-action martial arts cinema than traditional animation brawls. But visuals alone don't make a movie work, and the film's emotional core rests heavily on its central theme: trust. This idea appears everywhere in the narrative. The entire world of Kumandra is built around the consequences of losing trust between communities. The tribes separated because they believed cooperation was too risky. Each region became protective of its own resources, its own survival strategies, its own power. Raya herself is a product of that environment. She's trained to be cautious, skeptical, and prepared for betrayal. When she begins the journey to find the last dragon, her instinct is to rely only on herself. Every decision she makes early in the story reflects that mindset. That's where Sisu becomes such an interesting counterbalance. Voiced by Awkwafina, Sisu embodies the opposite philosophy. She believes people are fundamentally capable of goodness if someone is willing to trust them first. That optimism might sound naive in the world Raya lives in, but the film slowly explores whether that optimism might actually be the only path toward repairing Kumandra. Their conversations throughout the journey become the emotional backbone of the movie. Raya often pushes back against Sisu's belief in people, pointing out that betrayal is exactly what shattered the world in the first place. Sisu doesn't deny that reality. Instead, she suggests that fear of betrayal can be just as destructive as betrayal itself. What makes this dynamic work is that the film doesn't present easy answers. There are moments where Raya's caution seems justified. There are moments where Sisu's trust leads to progress. The narrative constantly moves between those two perspectives, allowing the audience to wrestle with the same question the characters face. Another strength of the movie is its ensemble cast. Along the journey, Raya gathers companions from different regions of Kumandra. Each one represents a different way people adapted to the fractured world. There's Baun, the young entrepreneur running a boat restaurant across a dangerous river. There's Tong, a quiet warrior carrying the emotional weight of devastating loss. There's Little Noi, a clever toddler surviving through street smarts and teamwork with her monkey companions. None of these characters are there just for comic relief or filler. They represent fragments of Kumandra itself. When they travel together, the group becomes a miniature version of the unity the world lost. Of course, the most complicated relationship in the film remains the one between Raya and Namaari, played by Gemma Chan. Their rivalry carries emotional complexity because it's rooted in both personal betrayal and political responsibility. Namaari isn't a traditional villain driven by cruelty or greed. She's someone raised to believe that protecting her people requires strength, caution, and sometimes ruthless decisions. From her perspective, Raya's approach to trust might seem reckless. That ambiguity keeps their interactions interesting. Every time they meet, you sense that the conflict between them could move toward reconciliation or escalate into something worse. The tension never feels predictable. Now, if we're being completely honest as critics, the film isn't perfect. One critique that surfaced among reviewers is that the pacing in the middle section of the story can feel a little rushed. The journey across multiple lands of Kumandra introduces fascinating environments and cultures, but sometimes the narrative moves so quickly that audiences don't get as much time as they might want to fully explore those regions. Some viewers also wish the film spent more time developing the political relationships between the tribes. The idea of a once unified kingdom breaking apart is compelling, and there's potential for deeper exploration of how each tribe adapted to the division. But even with those criticisms, the film's strengths outweigh its shortcomings. The emotional arc of Raya learning to trust others feels sincere. The world building is visually stunning, and the themes resonate in a way that feels surprisingly relevant. In many ways, the story's message about rebuilding trust in a fractured society reflects challenges that exist far beyond the fictional land of Kumandra. People often talk about animated films as if they're primarily for children, but the best ones operate on multiple levels. Kids might see an exciting adventure about dragons and heroes. Adults might see a reflection on leadership, fear, and the difficult work of reconciliation. And Raya and the Last Dragon definitely falls into that category. It's an adventure movie, yes, but it's also a story about whether people who have grown apart can find the courage to believe in each other again. One of the most enjoyable things about revisiting Raya and the Last Dragon after you've already seen it once is realizing how many thoughtful details the filmmakers quietly tucked into the story. On the surface, it plays like a straightforward adventure. Find the dragon, restore the gem, save the world. But when you slow down and start looking closely, there are dozens of small creative choices that deepen the world of Kumandra in subtle ways. Let's start with the cultural inspiration behind the world itself. Kumandra isn't meant to represent a single country. Instead, the filmmakers pulled ideas from across Southeast Asia: Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos, Malaysia, and the Philippines. The architecture, clothing patterns, weapons, food, and even martial arts styles reflect a blend of these influences. To make sure those inspirations were handled respectfully, Disney created a group of cultural consultants, known internally as the Southeast Asia Story Trust. These advisors worked with the creative team throughout production, offering feedback on everything from traditional cooking methods to ceremonial customs. That level of consultation doesn't always get noticed by casual viewers, but it played a huge role in making Kumandra feel authentic rather than generic. Food is actually one of the most charming examples of this attention to detail. If you watch closely during scenes in marketplaces or kitchens, you'll notice dishes inspired by real Southeast Asian cuisine. Things like noodle soups, grilled seafood, rice dishes, and tropical fruits. Even Boone's Shrimp Boat restaurant is a nod to the vibrant street food culture found throughout the region. Then there's the symbolism built into the geography of Kumandra itself. If you look at a map of the kingdom, the 5 lands, heart, fang, spine, talon, and tail, are arranged in a shape that resembles a dragon. That design isn't just aesthetic. It reinforces the idea that the world used to exist as one complete entity before it fractured into separate territories. Each region also visually reflects the mindset of its people. Heart is lush and open, with flowing water and warm colors, representing its belief in unity. Fang is sleek and fortified, with narrow streets and controlled architecture that mirrors its culture of caution and order. Spine feels harsh and rugged, full of jagged cliffs and cold landscapes that reflect the toughness required to survive there. Talon thrives on trade and adaptability, shown through its bustling markets and chaotic alleyways. Tail is dry and sparse, symbolizing isolation and endurance. These environmental details quietly reinforce the film's central theme: the way geography, culture, and history shape how communities see each other. Another fascinating behind-the-scenes fact involves the dragons themselves. In many Western fantasy stories, dragons are portrayed as large, winged creatures inspired by European mythology. But Sisu's design draws heavily from Eastern dragon traditions, where dragons are often long, serpentine, and associated with water, clouds, and wisdom. That's why Sisu's body moves more like a flowing ribbon than a flying reptile. Her movements are smooth and fluid, almost like she's swimming through the air. The animators spent a surprising amount of time studying water movement and animal locomotion to achieve that graceful effect. There's also a hidden storytelling element in Sisu's magical abilities. Each time Raya recovers another piece of the dragon gem, Sisu gains access to powers originally belonging to one of her dragon siblings. So the different abilities she displays, control over mist, rain, or transformation, aren't random magical tricks. They represent the legacy of the dragons who sacrificed themselves long before the story begins. And speaking of animation, one of the technical achievements of the film is how expressive the characters' faces are. Modern Disney animation has become incredibly sophisticated when it comes to subtle emotional performance. Tiny movements in the eyebrows, slight shifts in the mouth, and changes in eye focus can communicate entire emotional beats without dialogue. That level of nuance becomes especially important during the quiet moments between Raya and Namaari. Their rivalry carries a lot of unspoken history, and the animators often rely on visual cues, hesitation, eye contact, posture, to convey what the characters are feeling without needing to explain it in words. Another clever detail involves Raya's weapon, her flexible sword. It's not just a stylistic design choice. The weapon reflects her adaptability as a fighter. Unlike rigid swords used for brute strength, Raya's blade can bend and extend, allowing her to respond quickly to changing situations. It's essentially a visual metaphor for the leadership style she eventually learns, strength combined with flexibility. Even Tuk Tuk, Raya's adorable rolling companion, has hidden inspiration behind his design. The animators described him as a mix of an armadillo, a pill bug, and a pug. His round shell allows him to curl up and roll like a wheel, which becomes a practical travel method across Kumandra's varied landscapes. But beyond the visual details, one of the most interesting aspects of the film is how it approaches the idea of villains. Technically, the main threat in the story is the Droon, those shadowy creatures that turn people into stone. But the Droon aren't really villains in the traditional sense. They're more like a natural disaster, a destructive force that spreads when human conflict creates instability. In other words, the real problem in Kumandra isn't the Droon themselves, it's the mistrust between people that allowed the Droon to return. That storytelling choice is surprisingly mature for a family film. Instead of framing the conflict as good characters fighting an evil enemy, the movie suggests that division and fear can create problems far worse than any monster. And then there's the ending, which quietly reinforces that idea. When the final pieces of the Dragon Gem are brought together, the solution doesn't come from one hero defeating the darkness through strength alone. It comes from multiple characters choosing to trust each other, even after betrayal and loss. That moment is the culmination of everything the story has been building toward. Raya's journey isn't just about collecting magical artifacts. It's about learning that leadership sometimes means taking the first step toward trust, even when the outcome isn't guaranteed. If you think about it, that's a pretty powerful message to build an adventure film around. And that's really what makes Raya and the Last Dragon interesting, beyond its animation or action scenes. It's a story about a fractured world learning how to reconnect. A world where people have to decide whether cooperation is still worth the risk. Those themes might be wrapped in dragons, magical gems, and sweeping fantasy landscapes, but at their core, they're deeply human ideas. Ideas about trust, forgiveness, and the courage it takes to rebuild something that was once broken. When people talk about whether a film like Raya and the Last Dragon can become a blockbuster, they usually jump straight to box office numbers. But honestly, that's only part of the conversation, especially for a movie that arrived during such an unusual moment in the entertainment industry. The real question isn't just how much money it makes during opening weekend. The deeper question is whether the film has the ingredients that allow it to grow into something bigger over time. Cultural impact, repeat viewings, strong characters, and a world that audiences want to revisit. The first factor is world building. Disney has always understood that one of the most powerful tools in storytelling is creating a place that audiences want to return to. Think about the kingdom of Arendelle from Frozen, or the oceanic world explored in Moana. Those films didn't just tell a story, they introduced entire environments filled with culture, mythology, and personality. Kumandra fits into that tradition surprisingly well. The land is divided into 5 regions, each with distinct visual identity, traditions, and leadership structures. That kind of design immediately opens the door for expanded storytelling. Animated series, spin-offs, sequels, or even theme park adaptations become possible because the world already feels bigger than the story we see in the film. That's actually one of the quiet strengths of the movie. Even though Raya travels through multiple regions, the film only scratches the surface of what those lands might contain. Each territory hints at deeper histories and cultural traditions that could easily support additional stories in the future. Another factor that supports blockbuster potential is character design. Disney Animation thrives when it creates characters that audiences emotionally connect with and remember years later. Raya herself fits the mold of a modern Disney hero, capable, determined, and complex, without losing a sense of compassion. Her personality is shaped by the fractured world she grows up in. She's cautious, sometimes guarded, and not always quick to trust others. That emotional realism makes her feel slightly different from earlier Disney protagonists, who often leaned heavily into optimism from the beginning of their stories. Then there's Sisu, voiced by Awkwafina, who brings a completely different kind of energy into the film. Dragons in fantasy stories are often portrayed as majestic or intimidating figures, but Sisu has this quirky, slightly awkward personality that makes her instantly approachable. She's magical, yes, but she also feels relatable. That balance between heroic strength and humorous vulnerability is something Disney tends to look for when building characters that can carry long-term franchises. Another reason the film has blockbuster DNA is visual spectacle. Modern animated audiences expect environments that feel expansive and cinematic. The animation coming out of Walt Disney Animation Studios has reached a point where every frame is packed with detail. Textures, lighting effects, atmospheric depth, subtle character expressions. Kumandra's landscapes were designed to feel epic. Massive rivers cutting through jungles, towering mountain passes, desert plains, coastal markets, fortified cities. Each location feels like it could anchor an entire movie by itself. And that sense of scale matters when you're talking about blockbuster storytelling. Audiences enjoy feeling like they're exploring a large world, rather than watching a small, contained story. The action design also helps broaden the appeal. Unlike some animated films that rely primarily on musical numbers or comedic sequences, Raya and the Last Dragon includes a surprising amount of combat choreography inspired by martial arts cinema. Raya's sword fights, chase sequences, and tactical movements give the movie an adventurous rhythm that can appeal to older viewers as well as younger ones. That wider audience reach is important for blockbuster status. The biggest animated hits tend to attract families, teenagers, and adults all at once. Then there's the emotional theme of the film, which might actually be its most powerful element. The story revolves around trust. Specifically the challenge of rebuilding trust in a world that has been divided for generations. That message resonates in ways that go far beyond the fantasy setting. A story about communities learning to cooperate again after years of suspicion feels incredibly relevant in many real-world contexts. And when a movie carries a message that audiences connect with emotionally, it tends to stay in cultural conversations longer. We've seen that happen with Disney films before. The reason Frozen became such a cultural phenomenon wasn't just the songs or the visuals, it was the emotional theme of sisterhood and self-acceptance. The reason Moana resonated with audiences was its exploration of identity, heritage, and courage. Raya and the Last Dragon tackles a theme that's arguably just as universal: the difficulty of trusting others after betrayal. Now, of course, the film's initial box office performance was affected by the global disruption caused by COVID-19. When it premiered in 2021, theaters around the world were still recovering, and Disney released the movie simultaneously through theaters and the streaming platform Disney+. That hybrid release meant the traditional box office numbers didn't fully reflect the film's reach. Many viewers experience the movie at home instead of in cinemas, which changes how success gets measured. But blockbuster status today isn't only about opening weekend revenue anymore. Streaming viewership, merchandise, cultural influence, and long-term popularity all contribute to whether a film becomes a lasting success. And when you look at Raya and the Last Dragon through that lens, it absolutely has the potential to grow into something bigger over time. Sometimes movies don't explode into massive hits immediately. Instead, they slowly build appreciation as audiences revisit them, share them with new viewers, and begin to see the layers of storytelling that weren't obvious at first. And Raya and the Last Dragon feels like exactly that kind of film. A story that might continue gaining recognition as people spend more time exploring the world it created and the ideas it quietly planted beneath its adventure.